James Thomas is a bike fitter with over 20 years of experience. In today's episode, how to choose the right road bike saddle. Starting off with 3 most common types of saddle.
Traditional saddles. We'll start off with a selection of traditional saddles here, but they are not limited to the 5 that we have in front of us here. Traditional saddle has a reasonable amount of length to it. It lacks any form of pressure relief channel and is the sort of way that saddles have been designed since the dawn of time. Examples of a traditional saddle are like a San Marco Rolls, Celitalia Flight Titanium. I guess you could call a Brooks, like a Brooks leather saddle, a traditional saddle. Physique Alianti, Fabric Scoop, Physique Arione. All of these are examples of kind of more traditional shaped saddles. Pressure relief saddles. I can talk a lot more about this because this is the type of saddle that I typically believe in. It refers to having a great big hole in it. Working on the fact that human beings didn't evolve to sit on their genitals on hard pieces of foam, this pressure relief channel is typically designed to relieve pressure from soft tissue areas. By way of that, it transfers all the pressure to the skeleton, which is generally much more adept at carrying load. We call them sit bones for a reason, and that's generally what we're looking to engage with the saddle in the most symmetrical way possible. The first saddle I think to ever come out was a Specialized 2-peg. The Turnix from Pro, one of my particular favorites. Celitalia SLR Max Flow, Gel Flow, Pro Griffin, which is kind of a bit of a rip-off of the Specialized saddle. Seemingly there are a number of saddles on the market that look a bit like this. The Bontrager Montrose is another one as well. So those are a few examples of conventionally shaped pressure relief saddles. Short nose saddles, it's a craze that started a few years ago. It started off, I think, with the Specialized Power. The whole concept of it was that it allowed you to get the saddle significantly further forward while still conforming to the UCI's 5 centimeter rule, which basically states that the saddle nose has to be at least 5 centimeters behind the bottom bracket. It was a means of limiting aerodynamic positioning in racing. And of course, there are exceptions to it. I think they call it morphological exceptions. So someone like Nero Quintana, for instance, who is quite small, if he has his saddle 5 centimeters behind the bottom bracket, it's going to cause him horrendous knee pain. There are benefits and there are negatives to it as well. Examples of the short nose saddle are Specialized Power. They also do this in mimic form, which is, I think, marketed mostly at women, where they fill in the pressure relief channel. Why that makes it a woman's saddle, I have no idea. Pro makes a saddle called the Stealth. Celitalia makes the fantastic SLR Boost. And there's also this sort of San Marco short fit jobby as well. So which one's for you? The system, or the design I use the least is the kind of more traditional shaped saddle. Sorry to call you out here, Fabric, but there are a number of negatives to this type of design because it typically results in the rider employing some sort of compensation to relieve genital or soft tissue pressure. Working on the grounds that a human being wasn't intended to sit on their genitals on hard pieces of foam, what commonly happens or occurs is posterior rotation of the pelvis. So the rider rolls their pelvis and their genitals away from the saddle, typically leading to excessive extension of their spine. And that'll cause you lower back pain, also makes the bike feel a lot longer than it actually is. Or they sit off to one side or they sit rotated. Now, the benefits to a saddle like this are that if you have an individual who is pelvically disorientated, golfers, rowers of a certain generation, I'm looking at you here, whereby it is ingrained in the body for the rider to sit rotated. If you're sitting on a saddle like this that has a pressure relief channel, what's going to happen is you're going to sit on it. You're not going to be able to interact with it symmetrically. So it's going to wreak havoc on you. Okay? So conventional saddles are generally well suited to individuals who are, like I said, pelvically disorientated. It is worth noting, though, that don't confuse this with somebody who sits off to one side because the saddle's too high or because the reach is too long or for whatever reason it might be. So again, this is a really strong argument for getting a bike fit and having your position diagnosed and actually assessed properly. So that is the only real scenario where I can think of whereby you might want to use a traditional or a conventional shaped saddle. Saddles with a pressure relief channel are one of my favorite designs. They basically take inspiration in shape from our traditional shaped saddles. Particularly if you look at Physique's range, they do the Alianti, Arione and Antares shapes with pressure relief and without pressure relief. But the whole concept is that this was intended to relieve soft tissue pressure, avoiding things like genital numbness and genital discomfort, and allowing the rider's pelvis to anteriorly rotate like so, basically allowing them to have better glute enlistment, a more neutral spinal posture, particularly through the lumbar spine, and just generally better saddle comfort. Almost all cyclists benefit from this system, based on the assumption that everybody needs to have pressure relief through, in between their legs. Whether you're male or female, doesn't really matter. Almost everybody needs or will require some sort of soft tissue pressure relief. It's worth noting that when you move from a conventional saddle to something with a pressure relief channel, quite often it can result in a noticeable increase in pressure on the skeleton. So when you relieve pressure through soft tissue, it doesn't just disappear into the ether, it gets redistributed to the skeleton. The skeleton, however, is much more adept at carrying pressure and carrying load. We call them sit bones for a reason, and it's just something that might take a bit of acclimatization. Short nose saddles, although they started off as being aimed mainly at racers, this is starting to become my preferred system, on the grounds that because it's a shorter nose, it has less likelihood of interfering with the rider's thighs as they pass through the nose of the saddle. This saddle in particular is one of the narrowest on the market, which I have fantastic results with. It's 130 millimeters wide, and what that typically translates to is a rider's ability to sit much further back into the saddle. One of the problems with a number of short nose saddles, sorry, Specialized, but namely the power, especially when you're talking above the 143 millimeter narrower size, is that the width of the saddle interferes with the rider's legs as they go through, as they pass through the bottom of the stroke. What that tends to translate to is this need to gravitate towards the nose, and of course it's a noseless saddle. So if you're sitting on something that doesn't have a great deal of support, it's going to cause you a lot of problems, typically translating to neck and shoulder issues and hand issues. We're tending to find that we're fitting something like this to I would say 75 to 80% of our customers are leaving on a short nose saddle. Saddle width. So it's a consideration. And it's something that needs to be taken into consideration. But we have big American bike brands to thank for this by means of saddle measuring. I'm talking about sit bone measuring specifically. And this is generally, in my opinion, this is a means of making the sale of saddles feel a little bit more sciencey. So you walk into a bike shop, you say, I've got saddle problems. So your salesperson says, let's measure your sit bones. The problem with this is they measure you in a way that you don't actually interact with the bicycle. So they'll typically measure you with your pelvis in a posterior state like this, and they'll measure your sit bones, which are your tuberosities, and the measuring of those skeletal landmarks typically translates to X width saddle. The problem with this is that you don't sit on a saddle like that, you sit on a saddle like this. So we're actually measuring incorrectly. And furthermore, I've come to find that when measured in this way, it tends to translate to a saddle that is too wide. And as I said earlier, when referring to the power, and it's not just specifically to the power, a saddle that is too wide tends to result in the rider's need to gravitate towards the nose, which in turn will cause you loads of problems. So in my opinion, saddle shape has more to do with a saddle's effectiveness for you than its width, it's the width itself. If we talk about this saddle, it comes in two different widths. It comes in an S width and an L width. The L width being 145 mil, the S being 130. I've got big guys riding the small saddle and small guys riding the big saddle. The only way really is comparative testing and ensuring that you have them at the same height, the same setback, and the same reach to the handlebars and all this kind of stuff. Make sure that you're being consistent with how you're actually testing the saddle. To a certain extent, testing is key, but if you're having saddle discomfort, it's worth noting that most saddle discomfort does not come from saddles, it comes from bad positions. You can have the best saddle in the world, not that such a thing exists, and if you're sat on the nose of it, guess what? It's going to wreak havoc on you. Saddle shape, there can be some deviations from the kind of traditional flat saddles with the pressure relief. I've got two examples here. One of them is an SMP we can talk about in a minute, but the first is a Pro Turnix, which is not dissimilar to something like a Specialized Roman. These are particularly good for individuals. Remember I was talking earlier about people struggling with the buildup of pressure on the skeleton. Based on the less flat nature of the wings of this, they can provide relief. So that's generally one of the saddles that I would tend to go for. Moving someone who has been riding a non-pressure relief saddle to moving them to riding a pressure relief saddle. One other benefit of the shape of this saddle is that it has a slightly more pronounced nose. So you're looking to get the middle third of it more or less flat. The more pronounced nose can help in some instances stop the rider falling into the front of the saddle or stop them from gravitating onto the nose of it. Which brings me on to the SMP. So I went through a phase of fitting a lot of these, and I stopped doing it because I just found them very, very tricky to actually get right. Furthermore, because the seating area is so far back, it almost always required the saddle to be slammed as far forward on the rails as it could possibly go. I'm not saying that there isn't a good scenario for these saddles, but I just found them very difficult and time consuming to get right. It's got a very, very pronounced nose. I also struggle to get my head around the aesthetic of it as well. But it's got a very pronounced nose, and the idea is that you sit in this kind of gully and the whole thing kind of stabilizes your pelvis like so. So you'll sit kind of in this valley. As I say, it requires the position to be absolutely perfect, your setback to be absolutely perfect, the reach to be absolutely perfect. And unfortunately, in bike fitting, there is no perfect. People change. You're taller in the morning when you wake up than when you go to bed at night. So I found this to be quite restrictive in terms of where I had to have it placed. So my best-selling saddle recommendations. Crazily enough, I sell pretty much the same saddle to the vast majority of people, deviating from it for specific needs of specific customers. My best-selling saddle, by a very, very long way, is the Celitalia SLR Boost S3. S3 refers to the width of it. It's the SLR is the range, and the Boost refers to the slightly short-nosed nature of it. The benefit of these is that it comes in a number of different iterations, ranging from around £100 right the way up to the mind-numbingly expensive £500 3D printed job. It's not actually quite that expensive, it's about £400, but nonetheless, very expensive saddle. I actually own pretty much every iteration of the saddle across different types of bikes and find this one to be the most comfortable, which is the endurance version. It's got a little bit more gel to it and has a titanium rail. The benefit of these, as I mentioned earlier in the video, is that they are relatively narrow, kind of deviating away from what we've talked a lot about in saddle fitting over the last few decades of width being a really important metric. It allows the rider to sit much further back into the saddle and doesn't interfere with their thighs as they move past the wings of it. For women, we tend to get really good results with the Ergon. Ergon's a German brand. They actually made their name in mountain bike grips, but they now have a range of saddles that are designed using the same pressure mapping systems that we use. This Ergon SR for women starts around £90 and has a really good flat section, large pressure relief channel particularly, which is much more, it's orientated much further forward than it is. Comes in a number of different iterations, all the way up to like a carbon railed super light model. I think the closeout thought for this entire video is that if you are having saddle problems, the first thing you should be doing is looking at your position. Saddle issues usually have almost nothing to do with the saddle itself. The industry has been very good at mechanizing the sale of product in terms of trying to medicate problems. We found we can reduce pressure going through the saddle by up to 50% just by putting arch support in the shoes. Stance width will have a massive impact on it as well. So what I don't want people to do is then go out on this self-fulfilling prophecy of trying loads of different saddles at loads of different saddle heights, because saddles are different depths. Saddle experimentation should be done in an informed manner rather than just aimlessly changing the saddle every 5 minutes. If you're having saddle problems, have a go at lowering the saddle. If that still causes you problems, maybe consider going and getting a bike fit.
That marks the end of this video. I hope you found that helpful. Let us know in the comment section down below if you have any questions for James, and if you'd like to book a fit with him, there'll be a link in the description down below. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to this channel for more.